So, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today to learn more about working with students who are on the autistic spectrum. I'm really excited to introduce Dylan Emmons today. So, before that, let me just introduce our team. My name is Joy Durham. I'm the director of the Accessibility Resource Center that was formerly known as the Office of Disability Services. That name was changed to reflect a more inclusive environment and to try to reduce barriers of students coming to our office and identifying with us. Our team is here as well. We have Kelly Farrell, who's our program assistant, Julia Cohen, who's our graduate assistant, Jessica Isle, our graduate assistant as well. And Elsie Bidas is away, but she sends greetings and she wished she'd be here. But we wanted to make sure that we have programming that means something to our community and that's supportive. So let me just introduce Dylan. Dylan is an author. He was diagnosed with with Asperger's at the age of 6, and he wrote a book called Living in Two Worlds on being a social chameleon with Asperger's. He's also a professor at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. I met Dylan when I went to Accessibility Conference in the spring. He was dynamic and had a completely interesting and unique perspective on working with students. And so I'm very excited to introduce him. So please join me to give him a warm William Patterson welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you for all of you for coming, for taking time out of your day. I know as an educator myself, every one of us is busy. Educators or students or professionals who are in the room, I really appreciate that. That being said, I really want to give you what you need in this presentation. So I'm going to stop with about 25 minutes at least, so that there can be an interactive question and answer session. But if something comes up while I'm speaking, feel free to raise your hand. I will do my best to address it. And so just a little bit more about myself. I was diagnosed with Asperger's at the age of 6. I've always known that I had Asperger's. And so right now I find myself in a unique position in that I know what it was like to go through the social stigmatization, to be dealing with sensory disorders and sensory processing disorder, and at the same time not be able to speak cogently about my experiences to those around me, and at the same time realize how that's impacting conversation and life right now. And so sort of when you see someone who may be in the throes of what I call an autism outburst or a meltdown or something, so that is like a very brief initial introduction as to some things that are going on internally. So since I have gone through undergrad and grad school, and then the hair-pulling ramen noodle mac and cheese post-grad school life, trying to find a job, and all of these very broadly, growing up and adult experiences, I often do feel as though I'm in two worlds, because I have my autistic, from the Greek autos, self, internal, really highly developed world. But I also, in my relationship to my fiance, in my professional life, in day-to-day interactions, I also have a very solid footing in the shared world. But for me, that also has in common something with neurotypical introverts. It takes a lot out of me to be in the shared experience all the time. And so I think that some of the existential exhaustion that sort of comes across in some of these interactions with students on the spectrum. That's just a sort of background, some things that you would take for granted in conversation, and just physical cues, all these things that would sort of come up subconsciously, personal space, taking turns in conversations, where your gaze is going, goals in conversations, some of these things that are sort of on automatic for most people, I have to shift into sort of manual mode. So in the back of my mind, I'm kind of shifting through the gears and processing, this is literally what needs to happen now. And so there is a sense of where the robotic is. But as an autistic person, I also do identify as someone having a narrow range of interest. And this can be a real issue, especially for people who have gen ed requirements, who need to, in school and in the workplace, need to step away from areas of interest to something that you may feel completely alien about. I feel lucky that one of my main areas of interest has been writing and language. And to that point, I feel that one of the better ways to introduce myself would be to read a brief passage from the intro to this book. And I will be brief, and you can hold me to that if you want to. But this is just, this is kind of talking about a common issue with students who are on the spectrum, but in higher ed and in the workforce and in these types of places. A friend of mine, someone I've only become close with over the past couple of years, recently told me, "I don't think you have Asperger's. I think it's all in your head." Immediately, memories raced up to meet this statement, to disprove it. Memories of conversations I've tried to have, of the countless times I've come to my senses in the middle of a conversation, only to realize I was interrupting, or standing too close, or rattling on in detail about something only I am interested in, like the Beach Boys. They're memories of losing myself in the world of language, of words and stories coming to me by the page, of picking up on subtle vocal inflections, of remembering thousands of useless factoids but forgetting my jacket. They're memories of meltdowns, anxieties, and rages brought on by bee stings, forgotten homework, and other minor malicious changes in routine. They're memories of standing out, of being bullied and not knowing it, and of finding confidence and camaraderie in spite of or because of it all. But memories aren't words, and in the moment I had no means of translating such experiences into a coherent response. No adequate way to, in one or two sentences, encapsulate for my friend an adolescence full of its idiosyncratic challenges. I can only smile and shrug. I must admit that I have some mixed feelings about anyone doubting my diagnosis, especially as someone who has spent years, and the greater part of my formative years, trying to pass in some way for normal. And by normal, I don't mean a fantastic, homogeneous, or utopian normal. Just the license that appears to accompany a person's association with the word, and that would seemingly follow me to functionally pass through the world without immediately or involuntarily highlighting my differences or eccentricities. Because most people, if they met me today, wouldn't know that I have Asperger's syndrome unless I told them. The idea that I might be mistaken or even lying about having autism spectrum disorder is a compliment and an accusation all rolled into one. Asperger's is a liminal disorder. It's a disorder of thin veils and blurry borders, of seeing people and their intentions as if through an opaque curtain. It's a disorder characterized by the accomplishments and setbacks of life on the edge of normal. Normalcy is never fully within reach because, like enlightenment or the perfect relationship, its very existence is dubious. For me and for many on the autism spectrum, some sense of normalcy, however, has been worth chasing. And it's in the chase that one begins, however slowly, to incorporate some of its characteristics. As a group, we may share many common traits, and yet everyone with a diagnosis of Asperger's or ASD or of high-functioning autism is as different from one another as we are from those not on the autism spectrum at all. So the ins and outs of the human experience on the autism spectrum remains mysterious to too many. To some, still to this day, if you aren't classically, immediately, identifiably, quote-unquote, Rain Man autistic, you must be normal. And so that's just a little inkling into my mindset in reflection over all my time in school and as to where I am now. There is a series by this artist, Federico Bavina. It's a sort of architectural representations of mental disorders and of neurological conditions. And this, to me, is quite an accurate representation of, if you'll notice, it's a spiral, but you can tell that it's a polygon and that it's in the shape of a home. So the shape of the home would signify a reliance on a sort of home base, a level of comfort that could be signified in a routine, could be signified by a group of friends, a support network, an area of interest. We feel very comfortable within our homes. And if you can see, there's this sort of spiral within. And that sort of touches on what I was talking about earlier, the sort of labyrinthine process a thought or a self-reflection takes to get from in here out into the world. Okay, well, reflecting manually through all these past experiences, is this an appropriate thing to say at this time? If I'm withholding this information, am I going to make the encounter even more awkward? And so sort of going around and around in a sort of metacognitive loop. And also this sort of spiral kind of, for me, represents some of those familiar neural pathways and those connections that are made and gone over again in my mind via routine, speech patterns, songs I listen to, movies I watch. I've seen the movie Donnie Darko how many times I refuse to tell you. But I wrote a final paper on it for one of my higher level classes, and so. Yeah, that's sort of, that visual representation says, I could go on about it, but that's where it is. So I do want to move into something that often comes up when I speak to faculty or when I speak to people who are serving a general population but also encounter a high instance of autism spectrum disorder, is how can you tell if someone is on the spectrum, assuming that they don't disclose? Because I can tell you from the perspective of someone who went to college on the spectrum, I'm from Binghamton, New York, and I went to Ithaca College, which is, if you know anything about the geography of the region, Ithaca's in Binghamton's backyard. But it's just far enough away where I felt like I could have this sort of a clean slate start. No one here needs to know that, I had this reputation in high school or middle school of being that weird sort of intellectual, creepy metalhead dude who walked home alone and all of that sort of stuff. And so even though right now, because there are a lot of more supports in schools, K through 12, than there were when I was first going through it. I was diagnosed in 1995 for some perspective. Because that is happening, there's such a higher, as you all know, there's such a higher instance of students on the spectrum who are college ready. And so here they are. And they want the same things that all of us want. They want to have a foothold in the real world, in a job market. They want to have a circle of friends. They want to feel as if they know themselves, have a real sort of solidifying of a coming of age moment. And they want to, they've been longing to do this sort of without the stigmatization that may have been following them. And so as a result of that, they may not be willing. So from our perspective as educators, we just wonder, my God, if you had told me, then I would be able to work with you. If you had come out and said something about it, it would have been easier. But this is a primary driving factor for why students don't come out, even on campuses where there are a lot of individuals who are like them. First of all, they may not know that because a lot of these students on the spectrum may be staying to themselves. And so, how can you tell? Because realistically, it doesn't matter if there's a diagnosis or if there isn't, because if someone is acting as though they're on the autism spectrum, if they're behaving in a way that reminds you of other students who are on the autism spectrum, then chances are some things that are in the playbook, as we would say, to work better with students on the autism spectrum would most likely work with said student. And so there is no clear sign, obviously, but any combination of the following could be a clue. Trouble with eye contact, that is a fairly stereotypical thing, but like from my perspective, I'm just as comfortable talking to you like this as I would be giving any of you eye contact, because in my mind, it's a very concrete thing. You can hear what I'm saying, and I can hear what you're saying, so what's the problem? Right? Because I don't rely as much on visual cues and subtle body language. I'm a very auditory person. I can pick up on inflections. I can cycle through between different accents fairly easily. I can vary that sort of, and so there are some similarities. There are some commonalities, even though everyone is very different, like I said. And I can't be a spokesperson for people with autism because people with autism are very different from one another. And I am able to give eye contact, and I've learned to enjoy it. But that's another thing that's sort of, like for me, I still have to like redirect myself. Eyes here, like those old conversations with speech therapists, occupational therapists, they're still kind of ringing in my head. Irregular speech patterns, echolalia, stuttering, unusual cadences, sort of a flat affect, the sort of Ben Stein syndrome, if you will, Bueller. So sort of, even if you're talking about something that is very emotionally involved, there's been some new research that suggests that people with autism and people with other neurological conditions may have a cerebellum that works differently than other people's. And so that is the part of the brain that is responsible for balance, but it's also responsible for editing your thoughts and editing and filtering thoughts and emotions. And so all of that sort of stuff means that it's more difficult for us to express, even though, we may be very happy. It's like the cartoon character Droopy. I'm very excited to be here right now. So like that may be something that, the person's just not interested. I can tell they're not interested in my class. They're not participating. They're just somewhere else. When they respond, they just tend to be, the answer is interphase, prophase. Like this, though they may be very enthusiastic about the subject, but it might not be coming across because of simple hardwiring. Stimming. So that's anything wringing of hands, excessive knuckle cracking, guilty, covering ears, twirling objects, interacting with light, sort of. So there's a lot. So as different as everyone is on the autism spectrum, one commonality is that almost all of us deal with a sensory processing disorder of some sort. For me, I wear shorts 6 months out of the year. I don't, the feeling that the comfortable feeling that most people get when it's about 75 degrees and you're just, oh, you don't have to worry about the temperature, it's just perfect. That's what it feels like 55, 60 degrees for me. And so just very, very different. And the other things to me, like if I'm driving in a car and there's sunlight through the trees, it's almost like synesthesia. It's almost like I can feel that. If someone's sweeping a broom on pavement, that sound, I can feel that sound. Or nylon rubbing against itself, I can feel that sound. And so, it's even for internal things such as eating, and when you're full, when I'm not full. So for me, assessing whether I'm full or not, like I don't feel full until I physically can't fit more food in my stomach. And so that's a major sensory difference that I'm experiencing, and that no one would know unless I were to express that. And so so stimming are reactions to these interactions with sensory stimuli. For every action that you see, there is a reason. For people who cover their ears and sort of go, so is it that sort of thing? Or for me, putting on music and singing along with it, it's a way to control your sensory environment. For people who, that's also a reason for, in conversations, students people who monopolize conversations. If I'm talking, and I'm talking about what I'm interested in, and I'm on my home turf, if you remember that picture, then the conversation is easier, because it's one sort of, like I got an image of a bulldozer in my mind. So it's like sort of a one track, it's sort of a one kind of a limited type of a view. And so I think those things are very much connected. And so the activity, the things that you're seeing as classroom behaviors and social interactions, a lot of these can actually be broken down to either a social anxiety or hypervigilance or hypovigilance, or some sort of sensory, some sensory issue that's going on in the environment. The wind, the light. For me, ambient noise and a lot of conversations happening at once, like grocery stores, like I feel like I need like the Das Boot thing from the Beer Fest movie, and like a couple of melatonin pills or something to deal with the grocery store. Like for the environment for me is just like the clattering of the carts, and having to redirect myself when Martha and Stacy are taking up the aisle, and then the next aisle the beer bros are just covering the whole thing, and it's just like, oh my God, this is like just very sort of a hellish sensory environment for me in some of those places. And other people, just like, and every day I go through Grand Central at about, peak hour, like 5, 6 o'clock. And I just have to kind of shut myself off almost to even get through that sort of sensory environment. So these are things that would be difficult for neuronormative people. But people on the spectrum have that extra little bit of awareness, that extra little bit of themselves that they have to give to those situations. Personal space issues are sort of rife. That's something that doesn't necessarily come naturally, and of course that's not everyone. And it doesn't go, someone who might be like the Seinfeld close talker, someone like that might also be a person who, if you brush some lint off their shoulder, they're going to be. So there's a sort of lack of, okay, we can be especially perseverative when it comes to a problem. Speech may speed up, you might stumble over words. So something that comes up in class that's either interesting or that's troubling the student, like they might raise their hand 15 minutes later about something you covered in class 30 minutes ago, because they're still working on this problem. Something came up for them, and it's like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the short story Epicac by Kurt Vonnegut. It's about this supercomputer that becomes self-aware, and he burns himself out because he's trying to solve an unsolvable problem. And so that, I felt that way. I remember feeling that way in math class, where something that's very concrete, but it didn't align with the problem didn't align with my line of thinking. I do chess puzzles every day, and sometimes I can't get to the next part of the chess puzzle because I feel like I'm stuck in my way of thinking, and I can't get to that next, to the right move, because I'm sort of stuck on this problem. Irregular speech patterns, so non sequiturs, oversharing. I know that, as someone who's an educator, I've had several autistic students in the class who tend to overshare, or they tend to talk about things that they're interested in, but might not necessarily be relevant to the conversation at hand in the class. And so these things that feel like non sequiturs for everyone else involved, it's not as if the student is trying to actively steer the conversation away from something, in my experience and in my view. It's more that it's almost like you're going on this like when you're on a daydream and you're looking and it's like, oh, that's a gray carpet. And I remember I watched a documentary several years ago where they were talking about gray aliens and aliens. The president is fixated on illegal aliens. And so these sort of loops. And so then I raise my hand and start talking about Donald Trump when people are talking about flooring. Those like sort of logical leaps that are occurring in my mind, because I don't have as much of a natural ability to sort of in a very theory of mind way, take myself out of myself and put myself in someone else's shoes. That sort of process has to be kind of, okay, like, hold on a minute. How did you get to that thought? We want to hear what you're saying in this class, but some of us are a little lost as to how we got from here to here. Could you explain that for us? And of course, that could lead, that strategy isn't always going to work, because sometimes that could lead to another 5 minutes of why Wayne Gretzky wasn't the best hockey player. But in some cases, it could be very helpful, because the student could be able to explain how they got from this thought to another thought. And sort of the same way with biology, where neurodiversity is, or not neurodiversity here, but environmental diversity, a species diversity in an environment strengthens the environment. In a college classroom, difference of perspectives can really enhance everyone's experience to sort of, and so I guess my little soapbox is don't give up on those students, because they could, if we're able to sort of redirect them and get more and encourage more self-awareness, you have someone who is fairly guaranteed to give you a perspective that's sort of outside the norm. And I think that's very valuable. Disorganization, I'm an organized, my room is organized by messes. So I have my paperwork mess, I have my clothing mess, I have my cat toys mess, I have all of these things, and so I know where everything is, but it's messy, and I'm an educator, and I have a filing system, but but I do know where things are. So disorganization, I say, because from outside in, it looks very disorganized. But for me, internally, it's more of like an organization that has its own internal rules. And so, but that very comfortable home-like sort of self-organization might not always be what's best for the student. And so for some students who might be more neuronormative, or who are more used to saying, oh, well, that didn't work, I'm going to try something else. Like students on the spectrum can be more stubborn about staying with things that have worked in the past for them and not really computing or having it have to be sort of latent realization as to why something is not working, even though it has in the past. Those two things, that sort of thing, but it's worked before, but this is how I've always done it. Well, this essay structure is different from the structure you've done in the past. But in the past, we had an intro paragraph and 2 body paragraphs and a conclusion. Well, I'm asking you to look at it differently. But in the past, this is what we did. And so that sort of, those barriers, that wall is a little bit tougher for students on the spectrum. And they will often get there, but there sometimes needs to be a different timeline of success and definitions of success for students on the spectrum, which is just as difficult for the student themselves to realize as it is for the educators and the advisors involved. I saw your hand, I'm going to get to you. But something like for someone who college seems like a good idea, but a big question mark, just being able to get through a semester passing 2 of their classes and having to withdraw from 2 classes, that seems like for most of us an outcome that we would want to avoid, right? However, it would represent a major success in transitioning into school for someone on the spectrum, even though you're going to have to go back and figure out with those 2 other classes what makes sense. Maybe there's summer school. Maybe summer school helps to have more of a routine rather than having another huge 3-month gap in the year, where then in the fall I have to figure out school again, right? So different, I think for both sides, getting used to different timelines of success is something that has to kind of be thought about a bit more. We can seem off-putting, we can seem opinionated. In some cases we are opinionated, in a lot of cases, because it's just such an intense focus. Not everything is the autism. Sometimes it is just an arrogant person on the spectrum. But a lot of the time it's just something that could be put down to a pattern of speech, or something that could be put down to a sort of a curtness that's born from exhaustion in the sensory and physical and shared world. And I don't think that students recognize that as, the neuronormative students. I think there's a lack of understanding amongst peers, even though there's a lot more information out there now than there has been in the past. We talked about flat affect. So I would like to come back to you. You had your hand up.
I was just wondering about the disorganization. Would you be able to trace that back to like some kind of neurological basis, or I guess just more of an understanding?
Sure. See, in my mind, one thing that it's immediately linked to is sort of having a tendency to be in the moment or occupied with a task. And we are not great, as people on the spectrum, we are not excellent multitaskers in a way, unless it's like listening to like our favorite music and doing a task. And then you have to check on us and make sure we have food, because then we could be gone for 6 hours. But I think that ability to look into the future and say, okay, I need to think about when when am I going to need to find this paper later? Where am I going to need to look at it? And so sort of that questioning process almost has to be external at first, like a list of questions to be drawn up to like a sticky note in immediate view while the task is still going on, so that thought process can sort of be manually integrated and included. And it's just sort of so that will become muscle memory after a while in our own way. But it does come from kind of almost like a Hunter S. Thompson style of writing, or a free flow kind of a way of living, sort of from this moment to the next, to one thought connects to the other thought, connects to this. It doesn't make for a type A organized home necessarily. So are there any, before I go on to my other sort of informational stuff, have there been any questions that have come up from what I've said that you want to address? All right. As I said, I will stop before, with a good 20-25 minutes so we can have questions. This graphic here just shows the three major areas that impact just about everyone on the spectrum, and how they're all related. Obviously, communication, behavior, social functioning, all three are influenced by the others. So here are some possible overlooked issues, things that may not be obvious. The transition period. Obviously, for someone who is so routine-oriented as I am, even when my life is in chaos, and when I was just out of grad school and I got my first adjunct professor positions, and I was trying to I had a routine, and then in the summer life was like open again, and that's like the opposite of claustrophobia. It's like sort of it's like a rejection of wide open schedules and wide open spaces. So I would come up with a routine. I would go to the gym, and then I would come back, and then I would go to Starbucks to write, and then I would do this and that and the other thing. So that was like helping myself through that transition. A transition to college is a major transition for students and a population that inherently detests most transitions, from a place of comfort to a place of uncertainty. Because for someone on the spectrum, everyday life is rife with a lot of uncertainty. So I'm going to now put myself willingly into a position where things aren't certain. And so that what really helps in the process of transition is making the unfamiliar familiar. So if you would have, for college visits, I did twice as many pre-visits to my college as other people did. I went there a couple times just to get the lay of the land, to get to know the campus. Went there again to meet with, whoever would meet with me in the disability services department, in the writing department. Went there another time to walk through my schedule on campus when I first moved in, walked through my schedule. And, that's, just all kind of like dipping your toes in, and then the legs, and then up to the waist, that sort of process. Working with narrow range of interest. This is something that I already brought up, and I'm also noticing that a lot of students in what I can now say is this next generation coming up, is that increasingly they feel as if something is not relating to something that they're interested in, they will come right out and tell you, I don't really, I'm having a tough time because I'm not interested in this. I'm having a tough time because this is not really my thing. And one thing that I say is, well, this is a college skill. Find yourself in it. Find yourself in this subject somehow. But that's difficult. And so something that works in that way is being creative with that and trying to branch out from areas of interest. So for instance, this is a physics class, but the person has a high interest in Spider-Man, or my personal favorite, Batman. Okay, you can't talk about Batman every day in class, please, but what about a final paper that's on the physics of Batman, or the physics of Spider-Man, or something, or sort of like, and I'm not saying that the curriculum should be tossed out the syllabus should be tossed out the window, but if there is a way to come to an agreement with the student and still have standards that, okay, this needs to be in by this time, and this needs to be in by this time, this paper still has to meet X, Y, and Z requirement, but I'm going to compromise on this one bullet point. That could be something that helps with branching out of narrow ranges of interest. Changing or disappearing accommodations, a lot of time in college, students will get extra time. In my case, one of my accommodations was a housing accommodation, where I got to have a single room so that I could crank Slayer and, punch my pillow and call my mom or whatever it is that I had to do. But it's very different from the accommodations that I had in high school. And that's one thing that is related to the next 2 points of support networks are changing and haven't caught up yet, especially for students who may be regional and living in the area, and they may not be living on campus full time. That could be very difficult because I'm in college, but I'm in the same environment that I grew up in. No, but you're a college student now, and these are the things that you have to do. You have to take responsibility. You have to talk to your professors. You have to ask about the assignments when you miss class. You have to bring up these things that you're struggling with. Oh, but I'm still in my room at home. But I'm still, the as without, so within. And so these sort of gray areas are not very friendly for someone on the spectrum. And so something that is very difficult is trying to create this new support network at a time where, as I already mentioned, students may be resentful of even needing a support network. This self-examination and self-improvement is rigorous and frankly annoying as hell, right? So it's asking them to, yes, you need to make your appointments and figure out how to do your own financial aid and figure out what are you going to do over the summer for a job or an internship, all those sorts of things that mom or dad or a life coach or a counselor used to do. Now it's on you, and you have a 20-minute conversation or a 30-minute conversation with an advisor about it. So that sort of, and we'll talk more later about this, but I think in some cases more scaffolding is in order for self-advocacy, because realistically that's what is needed to succeed in college and in the real world, is knowing what you need, knowing to speak up about what it is you need. Okay, I can perform the duties of this job, but, and this is a story that a boss that I used to work for over the summer one year, he told me that he had a worker on the spectrum who didn't do daylight savings time. So when the clock changed and now it's 8 o'clock instead of 7 o'clock, and the boss tried to have a conversation, you were an hour late to work today. It's daylight savings time. No, it's 7 o'clock. You can't change the time. You can't change the clock. You can move the clock. You can't change the time. So after like 3 or 4 such conversations with this person, my boss said, you know what? So we don't have John until 8 o'clock for this part of the year. And that's the way that's going to be. But for a lot of work environments, the person is going to need to be able to communicate that. I have trouble with this, and I can perform the duties of this job, but if I'm going to do that, I need this thing. That's something that at the same time that they're trying to learn everything that neuronormative people are learning academically and socially and networking, these things that neuronormative students may have picked up more readily on their own through life experience have to be much more conscious processes and stepwise processes for students on the spectrum. So top down versus bottom up. If you're familiar with theories of visual construction and representation, it's sort of the forest for the trees type of a thing. So a top-down perspective sees the whole before the things that make it up. And a bottom-up perspective sees the individual components before the larger whole. And so I am a very top-down sort of a person. That's how I see things. That's how I see the world. I've talked to other people on the spectrum who agree with me, some who disagree with me, but that is very much how I see the world. And so when I was in school, especially the first couple years of middle school, I was in total shock because I had 8 or 9 classes, and it wasn't like I had a half an hour of history homework and an hour of biology homework and 45 minutes of math homework. I had this huge amorphous blob of homework hanging over my head. And so I had to learn how to manually sort of slice it up into little parts. And that's more natural for some people than other people. But that very much informs how I view the world and look at the world. So I know that about myself, and I have to sort of step back and remind myself, okay, now scale back and look bottom up. We covered some sensory issues in new environments. I could bring up the example of Daredevil, who is a superhero who's blind, but whose other senses are heightened. So some of my senses are very dulled, some of my senses are very heightened. And so if you have a student, for instance, who keeps getting up out of the classroom, like up and down like a jumping bean, like that is like there's a need to expend energy, like a high level of energy. I definitely identify with that. And so not knowing what to do with all this energy, that's a sensory issue. And so there are also obviously communications deficits, stilted social interactions, nonverbal cues not setting in. So those are more obvious things rather than things that are hidden, but what it leads to can be hidden, which is depression. You can be much more sensitive to feeling out of place, or as if you don't fit in, or as if you're falling behind because you're struggling, and you can tell that other people know that you're struggling. And you're still you're sort of caught in that web of metaconsciousness and realizing what you're going through and knowing that you need to get out of it, but feeling this inertia. And so it's an everyday thing. We're often very conscious of our progress in comparison to others. And we're hard on ourselves. Those of us who are especially, driven and who want to succeed in academics, for those of us, especially for whom academics was a sort of refuge from the social interaction, and I could be the kid that sits in the front of the room and gets the A, and everybody thinks is weird, but whatever. So that could be a reason that you're handing back papers, most people got a C, and one student got a B+. And they get the paper back and they're like, I got a B+! It's because that's because there's so much weight put on that, because all of the other areas the student or person views as a deficiency. And so that could be a reason for things that seem emotionally concentrated or off kilter. We talked about a disproportionate burden regarding social interaction. Do I speak? Do I not speak? one piece of advice that I give students on the spectrum is that, who are always, they have asked me, what do I say? What do I say to someone who I want to be my friend? What do I say to someone who I want to possibly be a romantic partner in the future? And I tell them, don't worry so much about what you're saying. Learn how to listen. Learn how to listen well and listen actively. Because that whole thing where people mostly listen so that they can interject something that they have been thinking about, can be especially true for people on the spectrum, because we live in this internal world, and so when something pops up that relates to, even tangentially, something that we have been thinking about, bing, 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 we just light up like a Vegas slot machine sometimes. Students on the spectrum have difficult time initiating, maintaining, and reading friendships and acquaintances. So this means there can be a higher incidence of students on the spectrum overstepping professional boundaries if they become close to teachers, advisors, or staff. This can happen because, as a teacher or an advisor, you're very into what you do, you know it cold, you are into teaching it, and you have necessarily a professional way of dealing with people, and so for that, compared with the 18 or 19-year-olds who might be their peers, who are much more worried about the party on the weekend that the student on the spectrum may or may not be invited to, or may not even know is happening, the interactions that are available, the people that you feel understand you, that can be kind of a rare thing, can feel like a rare thing. And so more weight, disproportionate weight can be sometimes put on those relationships. And so it means that you might have to state in concrete terms the limits of your position. And it would seem rude if you were saying it to another student, a neuronormative student. But for someone who's autistic, it could be helpful to say, as an academic advisor, you're one of 180 students that I'm serving, that I'm working with. And so this is the reason I can't talk to you for an hour. Okay, I understand. There may have to be some clearer rules, concrete rules and concrete boundaries. This is one sort of blanket strategy that I can advise, is having things in the out front. These are the rules for this space. These are the rules for this is how we are going to do things here. Even especially as educators, we have goals for lessons sometimes, and a lot of times that is not what we would put on the board, but it would be something that's for our purposes, for our lessons. For someone on the spectrum, that could be very useful. What's the goal? So if they know the goal, then they know, okay, this is why we're doing this right now. So putting things into context is very helpful. Also, it's not so much of a lack of empathy. There's an over instance of empathy and of relating in some cases. But it comes down to a difficulty in interpreting social signals, which, texting, everything's texting now, and texting and messaging. And that's that's wonderful in one way for someone who's an introvert on the autism spectrum. But in another way, it's how do you know, you can't read tone of voice through text messages. And it's not like everyone's going to be using emojis every time they send a message, and please don't, because that gets infuriating after a while too. And so there are a lot of these things that are built in, including the society that we're in, that does not in the first place value anything remotely resembling self-reflection and learning from mistakes and those types of things. It's sort of a society that values confidence over almost anything. And so that's very difficult to navigate if you aren't confident and don't know how to act confident. And so I'm going a little bit on a tangent here, but something that could be very helpful for that would be, something that I got into, and I wish I'd gotten into earlier, but my senior year of high school, I was in plays and in musicals. And I found that I really liked acting. And that and I realized that, my God, now I'm picking up on skills that most people just have. Most people can just act a certain way when they don't feel necessarily like they're happy to meet someone, or necessarily like they want to stick around or whatever. But having an experience in an acting class can actually contribute a lot to development of practical strategies of going through the day, theory of mind, those types of things. So anything that gives some sort of distance for self-reflection. That's why a lot of people on the spectrum are geared towards narratives and stories in some way. Comic books, graphic novels, superheroes, whatever. And these are often things that depict human emotion and human contact sort of at like a 12. And sort of if someone's angry, it's almost like classical, like theater, like William Shatner acting or something like that. Like, what do you mean? Like, so like sort of in Disney characters, a lot of people on the spectrum, that's sort of like an underwritten stereotype. And of course, there was that article by Daniel Susskind in the New York Times not so long ago talking about how he interacted with his son through this universe of Disney characters. And it's because the emotions are so out front. Not a lot is left to the imagination, but by the same token, it's a great place to study human interaction. And so the next level would be, there's a great potential for psychology classes, anthropology classes, literature classes. I would almost love to see a literature of the non-neuronormative class or something like that, so that it could almost be like a freshman seminar that could be not a requirement but encouraged for like a wide section of people, so that it would give that distance to be able to study themselves. So that's just kind of a pet idea that I've been walking around with for a while. So here are some possible combinations and general strategies within existing frameworks. Alternative arrangements for assignments, we already brought that up briefly. More staggering, allowance for more feedback. And how I often pose this to students is, I teach English. If you're willing to do the work of doing multiple drafts, I'll read your draft. I'll give you more credit. Because if the assignment didn't compute the first time and you wrote 3 pages about the first bullet point of the assignment, I'll give you that chance to redo it, even if I'm not necessarily going to afford others that same thing, because it's a leveling of the playing field, because I understand what that student is going through and trying to understand their assignments. I feel very strongly that there still has to be an agreed upon set of standards. It isn't fair to have different sets of rules for different people, and that's something you can even be very upfront about with students on the spectrum. I have to, this is what I have to do so that everyone is on the same page and that it's fair for everyone. But if you will agree to hand in, say, an outline by Wednesday and a draft by Monday and then a final draft by the following Thursday, whereas on the syllabus for all the rest of the students it says this assignment is due at such and such a time. Having that extra bit of stepwise movement can be very helpful. It feels more concrete. It feels less abstract. I gave you the example of the daylight savings time guy. If you know that a student has trouble getting to class on time and it's within reason, like 5 or 10 minutes, then there could be other, it's up to your discretion. But if they're carrying their weight in the other parts of the course, you really have to weigh, does it make sense to enforce that so strictly as a rule? It may or may not. I have a couple more things to get through, and then I want to open it up to questions. More and different communication is often needed because reading between the lines is not a strong suit. Very clear, almost over communicating in some cases. If you're noticing that that the student is continually having an issue where they're melting down in class or they're having difficult interactions with people in class, you could work with them to develop a signal, some sort of signal that you and they understand so that it doesn't feel like they're being called out in front of the whole class. And then maybe they need to take maybe this nod means you need to take a walk for 2 minutes and then come back. Explaining the limitations, we already went over that. This is like an instance of scaffolding. I know you can do this on your own, so my suggestion is to do page 1, and then I'll check in with you at a later date with page 1 to make sure that we're on the same page. This is key, helping students become aware of social clubs or meetup groups or events and whatnot. Like I said, for students on the spectrum, like developing friendships, you might have to literally go to a place with the goal in mind of I am going to accumulate one friend today. Like that sort of thing that sounds robotic and sort of man from outer space type of logic. But this is, one of the last things, putting things into context. Today we're covering X, tomorrow we're covering Y, and it's going to prepare you for test Z. And even something simple like, you can expect more of this in your college classes moving forward. If you're having trouble with an essay format, we should figure this out now. Because in the future, you're going to see a lot more varying essay formats. And so I guess at this point, I would like to open it up to the audience. If you have questions, as to specific situations that you may be working with, general questions, theoretical questions, comments, what have you. Yes, sir.
I'm not a microphone person. We'll call them bulldozer conversations that aren't really conversations.
Right.
How should we deal with those? And it's two-part, from faculty in a classroom situation, but also if we observe that happening student to student.
Okay. So from a faculty standpoint, running a classroom, I would just be very sort of upfront and sort of polite interruptions. I'm going to have to stop you there, because what we're discussing we're discussing this now. So if you have a comment on this subject, I'll be glad to come back to you. But we have to move on. I know you understand things like that. So that can be it can be exhausting on the part of the faculty. But if it's something that's a rule and it's right up front and it's a general practice, then that quickly becomes the norm. In terms of seeing it happening student to student, that's a bit trickier. If you notice it happening like in a large scale in the classroom in general, with one person interacting with a lot of classmates, I would almost say that there should be some sort of conversation where you're asking them or pointing them to one of the great resources on this campus where they can have this conversation. How comfortable would they be sort of telling people in the classroom, this is who I am as someone with autism spectrum disorder, and this is what I struggle with. Sort of making it out in the open. And that's not always going to be possible because the student isn't always going to want to do that. But in the cases where that is possible, or where the student is willing to do that, it can be very helpful. It can get everyone on the same page. There's less of an othering because it's from the student themselves. Otherwise, sort of, just a brief comment. I saw, taking the student aside, this is what I saw. Maybe not being as prescriptive, but this is what I saw happening, and I think that this student may have felt this way about it. Sort of that thing that where they may not realize, obviously, how they're making someone else feel. And so just that sort of 2-second interjection could be pretty helpful, I would think. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah. I noticed that during a lot of the presentation, and from what I've observed, autism seems to be very, I guess I'll use this, that autism seems to be very audio-based. Could you just elaborate on that?
So I'm speaking from personal experience for that, but also I have noticed that as a commonality in students and people on the spectrum. So either there's a type of music that they really like or are into, or a voice that is like even it could not even come down to a broadcaster whose voice is comfortable and sort of familiar. I think that I don't really know, but like I'm also very into languages, and music is a language. And so it's sort of, I think people on the spectrum can be very pattern oriented, and visually it can be difficult to group things into patterns sometimes. Our world seems kind of chaotic. Things come out of nowhere. But auditorially it can be easier to notice patterns and to deal with patterns and to sort of recognize patterns and interact with those patterns. And so those are just a couple of theories that I have, but I also have noticed, I've worked with people on the spectrum who are at all levels of functionality, who have done music therapy, and that tends to be something that's very helpful in expression for people who have difficulty expressing, because things like, it's another avenue to get at emotion and to get at those types of things, where emotions may be difficult to decode, but I know this song is an avenue for this emotion to me, and it helps me to interact with this emotion or understand this emotion, or this instrument reminds me of this feeling. And so it's almost like having something tangible that you can grasp onto that relates to something that feels woefully at times intangible. And so, yeah, that's a good question. I would love to think about that more and in the future. Yes, in the back.
Hi, thanks. Two related questions. What are some of the things that you have gone through as you've become a teacher? What are some of the things you've struggled with and overcome? And are there resources for people on the spectrum who want to become teachers?
Okay, great. So one of the first things I remember I taught, the first class that I taught was a test prep course for the English portion of a nursing exam. These are students who were going into nursing school. And after the class, one of them came up to me and said, "You don't have to look so nervous. You're doing great. You don't have to look so nervous." And in my mind, I was kind of like, I love being in front of people. I love talking to people. Like I have control of the conversation. I'm talking about something that I know a lot about and that I'm interested in. And so I'm sort of in my home turf. And sort of my own ability to read that was lacking in that moment. And so that feedback from that student was very helpful to me. So that's one thing, sort of is like another aspect of looking in the mirror and being that self-reflective process of how am I coming across to my students. That first year I was thinking about that a lot. Organization was another thing, coming up with systems of organization that didn't feel too rigid for me, because some systems of organization feel so idiosyncratic, and so everything has its tiny little place, and like that just doesn't work for me. So coming up with things that worked for me. Also, frankly, specific areas of interest. So I was teaching some remedial English courses, and I do still teach remedial English, but I really love creative writing. And so how do I weave in a creative aspect? And I found that that's actually very helpful, because everyone wants to feel like they can express deep thoughts, deep feelings, deep emotions, and to give a space to analyze those things, and to see people who have been labeled as remedial students come alive and be able to interact with what's actually in a poem, or what a poem is bringing up for them, has been great for me. But that's sort of a constant challenge. And here's a curriculum that I'm working with where, there are some moving parts, but things are largely in place. But, there are places where I can really put myself and my flair into it. And now I don't know if I'm not aware of any resources for people who are on the spectrum and who want to be teachers. I think that people on the spectrum can be great teachers, and I think that there have been a lot of teachers in the past who probably were on the spectrum and didn't know they were on the spectrum because the rate of diagnosis was just so deplorable years and years ago for understandable reasons. But I do think that that's something you're going to see coming up in years as the populations that started coming to college a few years ago when I came to college, when they move up and are wanting to go into those practices. I do think that that's something that's going to come up. 5 minutes, sure. We've got time for a couple more questions. Yes.
I was wondering, you just mentioned a little bit ago about things that work for you or don't work for you. I wonder if that would be a good approach for a teacher who might have a student on the spectrum, which is to take them aside at some point and say, well, this is how the course is organized. But is there a different way that works better for you that I could try and adopt in some fashion?
I would absolutely recommend having those conversations whenever possible. Because that's, it's realistically, as educators, as professors, you have a lot on your plate and a lot of different classes you're working with, different assignments that you're juggling. And so if you can carve out that time, that can be very valuable to lay that all out on the table. And even posing the question to someone who's on the spectrum may need a day or more to think about that. And they might need to respond in an email to you or something, some such thing. But even having a conversation, even knowing that you are willing to do that can be big. And then putting it in concrete terms and asking them to respond in the same way. So what aspect of this are you having trouble with, or do you foresee having issue with? So that we're both on the same page about that, and then coming up with something moving forward, some communication strategy moving forward. That, in my mind, is an optimal way to deal with these things at the forefront, preemptively whenever possible. One more, yes.
You don't need it.
I think they're recording this, so I think it's for the purposes of recording too.
So my question is, I'm at Hawthorne High School and I'm teaching a bunch of students with my practicum. So I have a co-op, right? And I teach a guitar class, and I have a lot of kids in that class who are on the spectrum. And I've tried many different ways to get the idea of chords across to them. They don't get the tactile understanding of it. I've tried doing it an oral way. I've done visuals, and is there anything that I can try to get them to understand the information?
I think that is how old you said they're high school students? Okay. I think that one thing is that, and I know it myself, that I have weak hands. My finger dexterity is weak and my finger strength is weak to begin with. So that is something that is going to be like almost an innate issue for, a lot of students who are on the spectrum. So these are these like rolling chords? Like what? Like I forget the term. Like 1, 3, like
So
1
they're
and then
playing
3 and
guitar,
then
right?
5.
So it's just like your standard C chord or a D chord. So it's just finger positioning, but they
Right.
don't understand like the visual representation of the tab.
Oh, the tablature.
The tablature notation. So I've tried doing it in a
Oh.
way where I do it orally, so they
Okay.
understand that
Okay.
index finger goes on fret 2 or something along those lines, but they still don't get the information.
So like drawing, like, so the tablature is like a visual representation of where the hands go on the string.
Right.
Have you tried, or would you try, like actually drawing the fingers and having them and flipping the paper so that they're looking at it sort of in perspective? So that would be one thing that I would say, so that it's almost like more literally. This is like they're leaving less to analysis, because that analysis and at the same time trying to wrangle the physical body into compliance, I could foresee that being difficult. So if you were taking away some of that processing work by having it more defined visually and in the perspective where it's the same, where they're not having to flip it or anything, that would be that's a tough question. That's a good question, but that's I think the best thing that I could come up with. So thank you so much for coming, for spending your time. It was a pleasure to be here and to speak with you all. Thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you for your interest in learning about this, because this is one thing that makes a huge difference for people who are where I was several years ago. So thank you. It's been a pleasure.